Thank you, Randy, and all who are here. Let's jump right into it. What a year it has been in every aspect of society, for every family, and certainly for our schools. It has been a nightmare in so many ways, and yet there's hope in people pulling together. So for you, what have been the lessons learned from our experience with schools, students, families in this pandemic?
Well, first, let me just say, Dan, thank you for doing this about schooling, and thank you for having me here, and I hope that everyone here is safe and that your families are safe. And so, there's been a lot of lessons learned, but one of the things that I loved was I was reading Newsday this weekend, and there's been a lot of graduations and moving up ceremonies, and the quote I loved the most was from an 8th grade young lady saying, "We did it." And that actually shows the resilience of kids.
Yep.
So number one, there's a lot of resilience. Number two, kids like school. And what you see is a kid I was with in Rio Rancho, after I was vaxxed fully, I've been going to schools all over the country. And a kid in Rio Rancho, 5th grade kid, I'm in their classroom. It was one of the first days back. I'm like, "What do you like about school?" And this kid, he's wearing his hat. It's like, "I like being here." Yeah. And then another young adult says a high school kid in New York said last week, "My teachers were my lifeline." So kids are resilient, kids like school, and communities need school. And so it's not just that kids need school, but communities need school. So I think we've learned a lot of that. And then the other thing we've learned is just how amazingly ingenious and flexible school teachers are.
Yep.
So we've learned all of that. The one thing that we haven't learned, though, is we haven't learned yet how to use this moment to actually really not just recover, but reimagine. Yeah. That it can't just be about reopening, which we will do in the fall, which 95% of schools did by June. But what are we going to do to make every public school a place where parents want to send their kids, where educators want to work, and where kids thrive?
Yep. Let's stick on that theme for a second. Where students thriving and student learning. We know there's an awful lot of learning loss over the last year, and we've lost a lot of kids, like 3 million or something. That's not the school's fault, the teacher's fault. That's our society we live in. But do you have a vision for student learning that you hope we can move forward with coming out of this pandemic?
Yes. And, if you remember, only one thing that I say today, it's 2 concepts that I hope we will embed in schooling going forward. One is community schools, wrapping services around for kids and their families, like we do, and like in your old stomping grounds, Baltimore, the Wolf Street Academy. There's lots of other great examples. And number 2, project-based instruction. Yeah. And if we just figure out a way that we can do these 2 things and switch accountability so that we're focused on teaching, not testing, that will be a huge game changer. As huge as the vaccines have now been, a huge game changer for kids, particularly for kids who are marginalized or underprivileged.
Well, we're certainly seeing that at the college level. The project-based learning is one of the big themes across higher education. More chance for students to learn by doing and to develop the mindsets for lifelong learning, for collaboration with one another,
exactly right.
for success, and for creativity.
I'll give you an example. And look, I taught history, what a shock, and social studies at Clara Barton High School in Brooklyn, New York. It was a career tech ed school. My kids all over career tech ed. People used to think career tech ed was the old vocational schools. Career tech ed is learning cybersecurity. Career tech ed is learning robotics. 95% of kids who go to career tech ed schools graduate from high school. And they don't always go into the trade that they've learned. They go to college. It's a real game changer in terms of kids building confidence, feeling a passion for school, and being able to overcome lots of challenges.
So yesterday we had a set of educators from public schools in the region who joined us for the opening of the Ideas Festival. It was so fun to recognize them, heroes for all of us. And one of the things we worry about a lot is a potential teacher shortage. It looks like it's inevitable, and maybe the pandemic made it worse. How are you thinking about that?
So, Rand just did a study so there is going to be a teacher shortage unless we actually find ways to really value teachers. And there's lots of ways around it, and there's lots of things we can do to change that. But at the end of the day, we have to value teachers. The market has to value teachers, the society has to value teachers, and teachers at the beginning of this pandemic, they were valued. Like, parents had this front row seat in terms of watching the teacher at the other side of the Zoom, that's of course in places that had broadband, and seeing what teachers did. And you saw this amazing pay-on to teachers in the first few months. But then when the frustration started, because the pandemic wasn't over, Trump did what Trump did, and so you saw this kind of frustration because teachers wanted to be in schools. Safety was the way in, not the obstacle to, but you had what we had. So I think that we're going to have, so what Rand has found is that 75% of teachers in America are really stressed and frustrated compared to 40% of like-minded adults, and that 25% of teachers are really depressed compared to about 10% of like-minded adults. We're seeing in our surveys that a third of teachers are starting to consider retirement. And so we need them to be here, but we also need to diversify the teaching ranks. We need to have residency programs, but really, truly, we need to actually have the conditions in schools that make a difference for kids. So you'll see teachers and our unions really push for, again, community schools, nurses, guidance counselors, intervention teams, because we know that kids need the social, emotional services, and we need to deal with that trauma. So all of those things become important to deal with it.
Sure do. So you made a big announcement in May that schools would open and teachers and all the other frontline educators that are part of the union would be at work. Was that a controversial moment for you to bring that together? And are you worried at all about what's going to happen for our educators when schools open in the fall?
Well, look, I'm a teacher, I'm a lawyer, I'm Jewish, I'm gay, and I'm a woman. So I worry about everything all the time. So it's kind of my business. So having said that, so of course I'm worried, but this is why we made that announcement. Kids need to be in school. And what we didn't do last summer, and a lot of it, look, I blame the administration, the former administration, a lot. Because if they had even just listened to us, yes, we were strange bedfellows, but if they had even just listened to us, we would have been in school in September. What educators were saying was, give us the way to figure out how to prevent transmission, because we want to be in school. We did a poll in July that said 76% of my members said if we had the safety guardrails that we were pushing for, they wanted to be in school because they knew in-school learning was better than remote education. So the Biden administration gave us the safety guidelines and the resources, and you saw what happened between January and April. Obviously, the vaccines were the big game changer. But you saw layered mitigation, the vaccines, and testing really helped be the formula. So I'm confident because of how the vaccines are operating, particularly Pfizer and Moderna, that we will be able to weather much of the variant storm. Now, there may be something that comes up that we don't know, but in present circumstances, it looks like we're going to be able to weather them, and people need to plan. We need to plan for lower class size. We need to get the guidance counselors. We need to get the nurses. We need to plan curriculum. We need to make sure we are planning academic, social, emotional recovery. So what happened was, since April 2020, we at the AFT have tried to find the path to reopen schools safely and to have a welcoming and safe environment. And the vaccines really helped move the agenda. And what also helped was this. The more people we had in schools with those safety protocols, the more people trusted it. The more people trusted it, we could build on that. And so both Secretary Cardona, myself, Becky Pringle from the NEA, we did lots of school visits. We used negotiations to actually get people back in. And by May 13th, May 12th, I did a resolution of my entire executive council, union leaders from across the country, unanimously approved what I was going to say on May 13th. So we were all in, and then the other thing we did was this. We did a $5 million allocation from dues money from union members to do a back-to-school campaign for parents and for educators. And we have locals all across the country that are knocking on, starting already. Last week, Pittsburgh started, Minneapolis started, knocking on parents' doors to try to build this confidence for parents that we have now built.
So you can't require
One
vaccinations of your members, but how's that going?
One last thing I'll say, which is more than vaccines, we got to get, well, vaccines are really important, but we got to get the ventilation systems fixed. We need to have that, not just about COVID, but look how many asthmatics we have all throughout the country. We need to make sure that kids can breathe in school. We need to also fix lighting. We need to do a lot of stuff that the Aspen Climate group has been advocating. Vaccines. 90% of my members have gotten the vaccine.
Oof.
People are really, and what we've tried to do is we've tried to do this the old-fashioned way by encouraging them, by meeting fear, by overcoming these things. And we're going to have to do that with parents. We're going to have to do that with middle-aged kids. And ultimately, we're going to have to do that with young kids. Mandating vaccine, it's a real splitter in communities. And part of my fear is that once we start any of these kind of mandamus, then what's going to happen is that's where the fight is, as opposed to what we need to do, which is recover the joy and the thrill and the rigor of learning and recreating communities of learning place-based.
Yeah. Let me stay on that theme, but take us off on an angle.
Sorry, I talk in paragraphs.
In complete paragraphs with topic sentences. We love it. So
That's true. This is Aspen.
I've been in a lot of really great public charter schools, and I recruited all these kids to Franklin and Marshall College from really fantastic ones. They thrived, they graduated, and developed great relationships. But my dad was a public school teacher for 40 years. And so I've been in many, many public schools and recruited a lot of kids from traditional public schools to Franklin and Marshall, where they knocked the ball out of the park too. So is this division between public charter schools and public schools something that we can mend, or are we just going to never be able to bring the adherents, the partisans for the two approaches together?
Look, it's going to take leadership to mend it. I'm sure it's still surprising to an audience at Aspen that one of my mentors, Al Shanker, was the one who actually thought about charter schools as a way to have parents and teachers get around the yoke of bureaucracy to try to do certain things. And I actually still run a charter school in the Bronx. I still live in New York City. That has a 95% graduation rate. But since that disrupts the current narrative about charters, nobody ever writes about it or talks about it. I think that a lot of people, I hope, have learned some humility over this virus. and over these crises. The crises of racism that we are in, the crisis of climate, the crisis about our democracy, and in many ways, how as amazing as the scientists were who created the vaccines, is how inequitable our health system has been, our economic system has been, and how, the virus has really exposed the inequities. And so if we really believe that all kids can learn and that all kids need a shot, then we have to solve these problems and not have these schools compete with each other. That's, from my vantage point, that's been the problem. The competition and the disruption as opposed to the collaboration and having people learn from each other.
Maybe that's a lesson learned out of this whole nightmare that we've lived through, or several nightmares, really, if you want to count them. So you think reconciliation, if that's the best word, is possible between leaders of traditional public schools and unions and leaders of public charter schools that are high performing?
I do, but then you have situations like what happened, for example, last summer, where the public charters or the Charter School Association invited me to speak. And I thought about it. I thought about how many tweets I was going to get to say eat shit and die if I did that. I mean, I thought about all of that stuff, but excuse me. But then the naysayers, so they invited me, I said yes. But then the Jeannie Allens and others of the world made such a ruckus that they withdrew the invitation. Yeah. So there has to be some small steps, but at the end of the day, what we have to be, the things that I am against is the trying to end public schooling, trying to end the public good. And so when people use charters as a disruptive influence to end what has to be the public good that is there to help lift up opportunity for all, that's what we rail about.
Yeah, thank you. Another topic, a lot of states are developing new laws about what gets taught in the classroom. And there's Texas, Tennessee, pretty recently, a lot of concern in some areas about, I'll just call it the teaching of anti-racist content. I'm not sure if that's the best term. Mitt Romney came out the other day and said he thinks legislators are getting ahead of themselves and we have to be careful about legislating what's taught. What do you think about this? Is this a real problem?
What the state legislatures are doing is a real problem. Because it feels like evolution, the fight about evolution all over again. Yeah. I'm a history teacher. And sorry, I'm going to be really, I am a history teacher. I believe in, and so many teachers, I'm no different than so many of my colleagues. We have to help kids learn to be critical thinkers. We have to help kids learn to discern fact from propaganda. How are we going to have a democracy if kids don't know fact from propaganda? And if we are not allowed to do that, if we're not allowed to lift up kids' lived experience, if we're not allowed to create a welcoming and safe environment for every child, if we're not allowed to try to figure out this discourse, to try to help kids see different perspectives, then how are we going to help kids become critical thinkers? And that's the problem with this. Don't make kids invisible. Yes, it's uncomfortable talking about racism. Yes, it's uncomfortable talking about Jim Crow. Yes, it's uncomfortable talking about what happened with George Floyd's murder. Yes, it's uncomfortable seeing that video over and over again that one of our kids played or that she took. Yes, those are uncomfortable, but are we going to be a society that is diverse and inclusive? Are we going to be a nation of immigrants that is bigger and better than we are right now? Or are we going to go into our tribes? And teachers want to teach accurate history, and my union is going to defend anyone who gets in trouble for it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Sorry.
So my mom was a historian, and she taught the history of women in the American West, which was not considered history when she started. Her first book was on sex workers in the American West. Then it was women prisoners, and went on from there.
I was going to say, they probably wouldn't let teachers teach sex workers in high school either.
Either, exactly. Her last one was on nuns in the American West, and the Catholic hierarchy didn't love it. So I hear you. Now, what can we do, though, to bridge these divides? Don't we have to engage the people that are casting these votes?
Yes, 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 yes. And part of the dilemma of today is that, whether or not our democracy was perfect, and it was far from perfect. I'm a big believer in, everything that Tim Snyder writes and that Anne Applebaum writes. But there was a view by both Republicans and Democrats, and I would argue independents, that the democracy was worth saving. And I think that we have to figure out ways of not being in our tribes or not being in our little silos, and how we find ways to work with, live with, engage with people with whom we disagree. And part of why public schooling and this whole notion of community schools are so important is that if we bring community together, even when we don't agree on different issues, we agree on a common humanity. And it's very important to find ways of doing it. And so some of the ways of doing it is through doing the work economically, like Joe Biden is trying to do with infrastructure, and trying to create something in a bipartisan way. Some of it is doing the work that we tried to do in McDowell County, West Virginia, to fight against a community being abandoned after it's abandoned by the coal mines. How do you recreate community and lift community up? But this notion of what we need to do to try and bring together, as we are fighting for reform, and as we are fighting for a more perfect union, and as we are fighting for more equality and more opportunity and more equity, we have to find this common strand of humanity so that we do not lose our democracy.
Do you worry that the teachers' unions are typically associated with the Democratic agenda, and that it's hard for you to be able to create the relationships that would allow you to have the conversation you just invoked with, in communities that perceive that all the unions care about is a liberal agenda?
So look, here's the big reveal. When I worked in New York State, the politician that I was closest to was Joe Bruno, the Republican chair of the state Senate. My union actually endorsed George Pataki for governor at one point or another. We endorsed Jacob Javits. The reason I'm saying this is I think what has happened is the parties have diverged on the issue of economics. And we believe that that working folk have to have a seat at the table. They have to have a shot, to borrow Lynn Miranda's line. They have to have a way to better the lives of our members. And so I think what has happened is that the Republican Party has moved to a place on economics that just become hard for us to support, but it would be better if we had people to support from both parties and people to support in a more holistic way.
The union must have Republican members, doesn't it?
We do. We have a lot of Republican members. We even have members who voted for Trump.
Yep.
And in fact, it was our Republican members in Florida, as Ron DeSantis was trying to actually kill the voice of our union in Florida this year, it was Republican members, it was veterans, it was others that said, why are you trying to take away our freedom? And so we're actually going to start a Republican caucus within the AFT, but this work is really important. But in McDowell County, West Virginia, where they have gone very, where there's been this huge sea change, if you work with communities, like I know that lots of people think we should have a political rural agenda. No, we should have a real rural agenda. The worst thing one can do is like fly into rural areas and say, oh, you should vote for Democrats. What we need to do is we need to actually make sure that, or do what we can so that there's a post office in a rural area, there's a school, there's a hospital, there's a way to actually create the Lockean social contract, the way of a public good, what FDR did, in many ways during the Great Depression, just trying to do things that gave people a sense of dignity and worth. And I think that is a vehicle by which to do this. If you don't meet people where they are, if you don't have a shared understanding, if you don't listen to what people are saying, because it's not what we say, it's what's heard, and we have to create this path of mutual engagement and mutual respect.
Well, we wish you the best for the fall. Thank you to you and all of your members for taking care of our kids. Let's all work together to build that common vision and bring people together for a future that can only be bright if we all create it together.
Thank you.
Randi Weingarten, thank you. Thank you.